The Innocent Man. Chapter 1. The Arrest. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Daniel Mercer's life was shattered. The sun rose like any other day, casting long shadows over his modest suburban home. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, reading the local paper when the doorbell rang. His wife, Emily, in the next room, glanced up from folding laundry, exchanging a puzzled look with Daniel. Before he could reach the door, it swung open with a loud crack, the frame splintering under the force of a police officer's boot. Several officers stormed in, weapons drawn. The commanding officer, Detective Reardon, held up a warrant. "Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest for the murder of Allison Harper. You have the right to remain silent." Daniel's heart plummeted. "What? There must be some mistake. I don't even know an Allison Harper." Reardon's eyes were cold as he moved closer. "That's what they all say." Emily screamed as two officers cuffed Daniel and dragged him toward the front door. Panic set in. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. He had never committed a crime in his life. He was just an accountant. A man who lived quietly, worked diligently, and loved his family. How could this be happening? As they shoved him into the police cruiser, the neighbors gathered on their lawns, their curious eyes wide with shock and judgment. They whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. In that moment, Daniel realized something chilling. His reputation, his life, was already slipping away. Inside the police station, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, Reardon tossed a file onto the table. Photos of a crime scene spilled out. Images of a lifeless body, a blood-stained alley, and worst of all, a knife marked with fingerprints. "That's impossible," Daniel stammered, staring at the pictures. "I've never seen this woman before, and that knife, it's not mine." Reardon didn't flinch. "We have witnesses, Mercer. You were seen near the scene the night of the murder. Your prints were all over the weapon. How do you explain that?" Daniel's mind was reeling. He couldn't make sense of any of this. Who was framing him and why? As the hours dragged on, the weight of the evidence began to crush his spirit. He needed help. Someone who believed him, someone who could fight back. But who? The door opened, and in walked a figure he hadn't seen in years. Jacob Wilder, the sharpest defense attorney in the state. He had once been Daniel's closest friend, until a falling out over a case that had left them both bitter. Now, Jacob stood across from him, his eyes filled with the same calculating sharpness that had won him countless cases. "I hear you're in a bit of trouble," Jacob said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Trouble?" Daniel replied, his voice trembling. "I'm being framed for murder." Jacob pulled out the chair opposite Daniel and sat down. "Then let's prove your innocence." What will Jacob uncover as he begins to dig into Daniel's case? Stay tuned to see what secrets unravel. Don't forget to share and subscribe. Chapter 2. The Defense. Jacob Wilder studied the case file as if it were an ancient manuscript hiding secrets within its pages. He'd taken on some of the toughest cases in his career, but this one felt different. The evidence was overwhelming, too overwhelming, in fact. There was something off about the way it all fit together so perfectly. He needed to approach this carefully. Across the table, Daniel sat with his hands clasped tightly, eyes filled with desperation. Jacob hadn't seen him in years, and the tension between them was palpable. But the urgency of the situation overrode old grudges. "You said you've never met Allison Harper," Jacob began, his voice steady. "But the police have witnesses claiming you were seen near the crime scene the night she was killed." Daniel shook his head, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "I wasn't anywhere near there. I swear, Jacob. Someone's setting me up." "Why would someone frame you for murder?" Jacob leaned back, considering the possibilities. "It doesn't add up. There has to be a motive, something that connects you to the victim." "Nothing," Daniel insisted. I've never even heard of her until today." Jacob's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the photos again, his sharp instincts kicking in. "Then we start from scratch. We look at every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and find the cracks. There's always something the prosecution misses." He stood up, pacing the room, his mind already spinning with theories. "You're an accountant, right? Is there anything in your work that could link you to someone dangerous? Any clients that might want to see you behind bars?" Daniel hesitated, thinking deeply. I work for a lot of people, Jacob, but no one comes to mind. My job isn't exactly the kind that makes enemies." Jacob tapped the table with his finger, thinking, "All right, we'll start with the victim, Allison Harper. I need to know everything about her, where she worked, who she knew, and if there's any possible connection between you two. If someone is framing you, they'll slip up somewhere." Just then, the door to the interrogation room creaked open, and Reardon stepped in, his face a mix of smug satisfaction and professional courtesy. He tossed a folder onto the table in front of Jacob. "Thought you might like to see the autopsy report. It confirms what we already knew. Allison Harper was stabbed multiple times, and the prints on the knife match your client's. Pretty damning, don't you think?" Jacob glanced at the report but didn't bother to open it. "If you thought this was an open-and-shut case, you wouldn't be giving me this now. There's something else, isn't there?" Reardon's smirk faded slightly. "The motive is still unclear, I'll admit, but we've got witnesses and physical evidence. Good luck proving anything else in court." As Reardon left the room, Jacob finally opened the autopsy report. His eyes scanned the details carefully, searching for anything that could be used in Daniel's defense. Anything that didn't fit the narrative. And then, buried in the medical jargon, he saw it. A small detail that could change everything. "Daniel," Jacob said slowly, his eyes locking onto the words on the page. "Do you have any history of medical issues? Any surgeries or injuries?" Daniel looked puzzled. "No, why?" Jacob's mind raced as he snapped the file shut. "Because the prints on that knife, they may match your hand, but not your scars. Something doesn't add up in Daniel's case." What will Jacob uncover next? Like and subscribe to stay ahead of the twists in the story. Chapter 3. The Twist. Jacob's eyes gleamed with the discovery. The small, overlooked detail in the autopsy report had thrown a wrench into the prosecution's seemingly airtight case. Daniel sat up straighter, his breath catching as hope began to stir for the first time since his arrest. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob leaned in, pointing at the section of the report that mentioned distinct markings on the assailant's grip of the murder weapon. "The prints on the knife were analyzed, and they matched your fingerprints. But there's something else here. There are marks that suggest the person who held the knife had a deep scar along their palm, possibly from an old injury." Daniel spread his hands in front of him. His skin was smooth and unmarred. "I don't have any scars, Jacob. I've never even had a major injury." "Exactly," Jacob replied, his voice taut with restrained excitement. "This is the break we've been looking for. If we can prove the prints were manipulated, that someone altered them or used your identity to place you at the scene, we can blow this case wide open." Daniel's mind raced, trying to process it all. Could someone really have gone to such lengths to frame him? But why? And who would be capable of something so elaborate? Jacob stood abruptly, his determination sharpened by the revelation. "I'm going to need access to the crime scene. There's something we're missing, and I need to find it before the trial begins." As he gathered his notes and prepared to leave, Daniel's voice stopped him. "Jacob, do you think we can really prove I'm innocent?" Jacob paused at the door, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "I've won tougher cases, but you need to be honest with me, Daniel. If there's anything at all, that you're not telling me, now is the time." Daniel shook his head, his face pale. "I swear, I've told you everything. I'm innocent." Jacob nodded once and walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Outside the interrogation room, Jacob's mind whirled with possibilities. He knew the prosecution had a strong case, but now there was doubt. A thread he could pull on to unravel the entire fabric of their argument. He just needed to find the right angle. The next morning, Jacob stood in the darkened alley where Allison Harper's body had been found. The crime scene had long been cleaned, but the layout of the area remained unchanged. He surveyed the space, picturing the sequence of events. It was a narrow, shadowy lane, tucked behind a row of shops, the perfect place for a quick, violent act. Jacob crouched near the spot where the body had been discovered. Something about the location nagged at him. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine the scene, the struggle, the attack, and the aftermath. If someone had wanted to frame Daniel, they would have needed time to plant the evidence carefully. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was premeditated. As he stood to leave, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Looking for something, counselor?" Jacob turned to find Detective Reardon leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a thin smile on his lips. He looked far too relaxed for someone supposedly in charge of a murder investigation. "Just retracing the steps," Jacob replied, his tone neutral. "Making sure I understand how everything happened." Reardon shrugged, pushing off the wall. "Doesn't matter how many times you walk through here. Your guy's guilty, Wilder. We've got him dead to rights." Jacob's eyes narrowed, studying Reardon carefully. "Maybe, but I've seen cases fall apart over a single overlooked detail. Don't get too comfortable." Reardon's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "You're digging in the wrong place. I'd be careful if I were you. Some things are better left alone." Jacob watched as Reardon walked away, his words hanging in the air like a threat. There was something he wasn't saying, something buried deep in this case that Jacob hadn't yet uncovered. But he would. He had to. And when he did, Reardon wouldn't be able to stop him. Secrets are starting to unravel. What is Detective Reardon hiding? Follow and subscribe to catch the next shocking twist. The investigation. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Reardon knew more than he was letting on. His casual threat wasn't just a tactic to throw Jacob off. It was a warning. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Daniel Mercer was just a pawn. Back at his office, Jacob spread out every piece of evidence on his desk. The crime scene photos, the autopsy report, the witness statements, everything the prosecution had handed over. He needed to look at this from a fresh angle. If Reardon was hiding something, there had to be a reason. And if Daniel was truly innocent, then the real killer was still out there, watching, waiting for the trial to seal his fate. Jacob's assistant, Claire, knocked on the door before stepping in, her face tense with urgency. "I found something, Jacob, about Allison Harper." Jacob's head snapped up, his focus sharpening instantly. "Go on." Claire placed a file on his desk, flipping it open to reveal Allison Harper's financial records. She worked at a high-end real estate firm. Her salary was decent, but her bank account, well, let's just say she had a lot more money flowing in than you'd expect. And then there's this. She pointed to a series of transactions. Large cash deposits. Untraceable. It's like someone was paying her off. Jacob's mind whirled. Blackmail. Claire nodded. "That's my guess. But who she was blackmailing? That's still a mystery." Jacob leaned back in his chair, the pieces slowly starting to fit together. So Allison was involved in something shady, and maybe whoever she was blackmailing decided to get rid of her. Frame someone else to take the fall. Someone like Daniel, an innocent man with no connection to her. It would be the perfect crime. But how does Daniel fit into this? Claire asked. "Why him?" Jacob frowned, staring at the evidence spread before him. That was the missing link, the why. "I don't know yet, but I have a feeling Reardon does." Claire hesitated for a moment, then added, "There's one more thing. I looked into Reardon's financials too. He's been making some unusually large purchases lately, way beyond what his salary would cover. And guess where those transactions lead? Jacob's heart skipped a beat. To Allison Harper? Claire nodded grimly. It's a weak connection for now, but it's there. If Reardon was paying her off, he might have had a motive to kill her and frame Daniel to keep his own hands clean. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline. Reardon wasn't just a cop trying to close a case. He was involved in something much deeper, and now Jacob had a thread to pull. But proving it would be dangerous. Reardon was smart, ruthless even, and if he sensed Jacob getting too close, things could take a deadly turn. "Get me everything you can on Reardon," Jacob ordered, standing up and grabbing his coat. "I need to make a few calls." As he left the office, Jacob's mind raced. He needed more evidence, something concrete that would tie Reardon to the crime. If Reardon had orchestrated the murder to cover his tracks, then there would be others involved, someone who had seen something or knew more than they should. But finding them would be like navigating a minefield. Jacob's first stop was the last place anyone would expect, a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. He wasn't there to drink. He was there to meet someone who could help him uncover the truth from the shadows. Benny the Shark DeLuca, a notorious informant who had his fingers in every illegal deal in the city. If anyone knew what was going on beneath the surface, it was Benny. The bar was dimly lit, the smell of stale beer and smoke hanging thick in the air. Jacob spotted Benny in the back booth, nursing a glass of whiskey. He slid into the seat across from him. "Benny," Jacob greeted, keeping his voice low. "I need information." Benny smirked, his gold tooth catching the light. "You always do, Wilder. What's it worth to you this time?" Jacob leaned in, his eyes locked onto Benny's. "This isn't just a case, Benny. I need to know everything about Detective Reardon. What he's been up to, who he's working with, and why he's paying off a dead woman." Benny's smirk faded, his expression growing serious. "Reardon? You're playing with fire, Wilder. That guy doesn't mess around." Jacob's voice was cold. "I'm not asking for a warning, Benny. I'm asking for information." Benny studied Jacob for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you better be careful. There are people in this town who'll do anything to keep their secrets buried." Jacob's heart pounded as Benny began to talk, each word pulling him deeper into a web of corruption that went far beyond a single murder. Jacob is getting closer to the truth, but the deeper he digs, the more dangerous it gets. What will he uncover next? Subscribe and share to keep up with the tension. Chapter 5. The Connection. Jacob leaned forward, listening closely as Benny, the Shark, DeLuca laid out the tangled web of corruption that stretched far beyond Detective Reardon. The dim bar, with its smoke-filled air and hushed whispers, seemed like the perfect backdrop for the revelation that was about to unfold. "Reardon's been in deep for years," Benny began, his voice low and gravelly. "He's been working with a crew that moves dirty money, laundered through real estate deals. That's where Allison Harper came in. She was their cleaner, handling all the transactions that needed to disappear without a trace. But something went sideways a few months ago. Word is, she got greedy." Jacob's mind raced, piecing together the information. So she was blackmailing them, Reardon and the others, threatening to blow the whole operation unless they paid up. Benny nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Yeah, and she had enough dirt to bury them all. But you know how these things go. They didn't plan on paying her forever. At some point, it's cheaper to make the problem disappear." Jacob clenched his fists under the table. "And that's when they decided to frame Daniel." Benny shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Why not? He's a nobody, an accountant with no ties to any of this. It's easy to pin it on someone like that. Make him look guilty, case closed. Reardon gets rid of Allison, and they all walk away clean." Jacob's jaw tightened as the full scope of the setup became clear. Reardon hadn't just framed Daniel out of convenience. He'd done it because Daniel was the perfect scapegoat. He had no connection to the criminal network, no history of violence. It would be an open and shut case, and the real criminals would continue their operations unchecked. "Why are you telling me this, Benny?" Jacob asked, his voice hard. "You're not exactly known for your civic duty." Benny smirked, his gold tooth flashing again. "Let's just say I don't like Reardon much, and besides, I know you're gonna owe me one after this. Big time." Jacob stood, throwing a few bills on the table. "You'll get what you're owed, Benny. But first, I need to bring this to light." As he left the bar, Jacob felt the weight of what he'd just learned settling heavily on his shoulders. The case had become far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Reardon wasn't just a dirty cop. He was the linchpin in a much larger operation, and if Jacob wasn't careful, he'd be the next one framed or worse. He called Claire as he drove back to his office, his mind working through the next steps. "We've got him, Claire. Reardon's been laundering money through Allison's real estate deals. She was blackmailing him, and when she threatened to expose him, he killed her and framed Daniel. I'm going to need every financial record, every document that ties them together. We have to nail this down before the trial starts." Claire's voice crackled over the phone. "I'll get on it right away, but Jacob, be careful. If Reardon finds out we're digging into this, he won't just sit back and let it happen." Jacob hung up, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He knew Claire was right. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. But he couldn't stop now. Daniel's life was on the line, and the real criminals needed to face justice. The following morning, Jacob found himself standing outside Reardon's house. It was a modest place, nothing flashy, but Jacob knew the secrets hidden behind those walls could unravel the entire case. He wasn't there to confront Reardon directly, not yet. Instead, he was waiting for a break, some sign that Reardon would slip up. As he waited, his phone buzzed. It was Claire. "I found something," she said breathlessly. "Reardon's been making large deposits into an offshore account. It's all under the radar, but I managed to trace it back to him. It matches the same amounts Allison was being paid before her death." Jacob's pulse quickened. "That's it, Claire. That's the connection we need. If we can prove Reardon was paying Allison off, we can destroy the prosecution's case." Just as Jacob hung up, he saw a figure approaching the house. A tall, broad man in a suit. He didn't look like the typical associate of a detective. No, this man looked more like someone who handled problems in a much more permanent way. Jacob's instincts screamed at him. Reardon was moving fast, covering his tracks. And now Jacob had a front row seat to watch it unfold. But he couldn't just stand by. He needed evidence, and he needed it fast. His phone buzzed again. It was Daniel, his voice trembling on the other end. "Jacob, I don't know how much longer I can take this. They're saying I'm going to trial next week." Jacob's heart raced. "Hold on, Daniel. We're close. Just a little more time, and we'll have what we need to prove your innocence." As he hung up, Jacob knew the stakes were higher than ever. If he didn't find solid proof soon, Daniel would go to trial for a crime he didn't commit. And if Reardon suspected Jacob was onto him, Jacob might not make it to the courtroom at all. The net is closing in, but who will come out on top? Follow, subscribe, and share to stay tuned for the next chapter of this intense legal thriller. Chapter 6. The Setup. Jacob's mind raced as he watched the tall man disappear inside Reardon's house. He knew this was a critical moment. If he waited too long, any chance of proving Daniel's innocence could vanish along with the evidence. Reardon was moving fast, likely cleaning up his mess, and Jacob had to act before it was too late. He pulled his car around the corner and parked, his heart pounding in his chest. He had one chance to gather something, anything that could blow the case open. Quietly, Jacob slipped out of the car and approached the house from the back. Years of dealing with difficult cases had taught him how to stay invisible when necessary. Tonight, it was more than necessary, it was vital. The windows of the house were dark except for a faint light spilling from the living room. Through the gap in the curtains, Jacob saw the man he had followed, standing with Reardon, holding a small black case. They spoke in hushed tones, but Jacob could hear enough to understand the gravity of what was happening. "I got rid of the records," the man said, his voice gruff. "Everything's clean. There's nothing left that ties us to Allison Harper." Reardon nodded, his face tight with stress. "Good, but we still have a problem. That lawyer, Wilder, he's been digging. He knows too much. We have to deal with him before the trial." Jacob's heart pounded in his ears. They were onto him. If they found out he was outside, listening, there was no telling what Reardon might do. He needed to get out of there, but not before he had something that could tie Reardon to the murder. Just as he was about to pull back, the man with the case opened it, revealing stacks of cash. Reardon took it and slid it into a nearby drawer. "Payment as promised," the man said with a smirk. "Don't let me hear about any more problems." Jacob snapped a picture with his phone, capturing the exchange. He had no time to lose. If Reardon realized he was there, everything could spiral out of control. As Jacob quietly slipped away, his mind raced with the implications. He had just witnessed Reardon finalizing the cover-up, paying off the last loose end in their plot to frame Daniel. But Jacob still needed more. He needed something undeniable, proof that would not only clear Daniel but take Reardon and his accomplices down for good. Back at his office, Jacob quickly uploaded the photo from his phone and sent it to Claire. "We've got a problem," he said as soon as she answered. "Reardon's moving fast. I just saw him paying off a guy to get rid of the evidence. We're running out of time." Claire was silent for a moment, processing the information. "We need to use this. That photo might not be enough on its own, but combined with the financial records I found, we can paint a clear picture of Reardon's involvement. We just need to tie him directly to Allison's murder." Jacob nodded, though Claire couldn't see him. "I know, and I think I know how to do it." Reardon's overconfident. He thinks we're still a few steps behind, but if we can get him to make a mistake, we can catch him in the act. The next day, Jacob set his plan in motion. He filed a motion to delay the trial, citing new evidence that was about to be revealed. As expected, the news reached Reardon quickly, and Jacob knew the detective would panic. He was counting on it. That evening, Jacob received a message from an unknown number. It was simple and to the point. "Meet me. Tonight. Same place." Jacob's heart raced as he recognized the location. It was the alley where Allison Harper had been murdered, the same place Daniel had been framed. Reardon was about to make his move, and Jacob knew it was a trap. But this time he would be ready. He arrived at the alley just after midnight, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The street was quiet, but Jacob could feel eyes on him. He had brought a hidden recorder, knowing that this would be his chance to force Reardon's hand. Moments later, Reardon stepped out of the shadows, his face cold and calculating. "I know what you're doing, Wilder," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're too late. No one will believe your little theories, especially not after you disappear." Jacob's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "You're the one who's too late, Reardon. I know everything about Allison, the blackmail, the money laundering, and I have proof." Reardon smirked, stepping closer. "You really think that matters? You're just a lawyer. By the time anyone looks at your evidence, you'll be long gone. Just like Daniel Mercer." But Jacob had expected this. He pressed the hidden recorder in his pocket, hoping it would capture the incriminating words that could take Reardon down. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed through the alley, footsteps approaching fast. Jacob turned just as the figure of the man who had been with Reardon the night before appeared. He was holding something in his hand, something metallic that gleamed in the dim light. Jacob's heart pounded. He had been right, it was a trap. The stakes are higher than ever. Will Jacob survive and expose the truth? Follow, subscribe, and share to see how this nail-biting thriller concludes in the final chapter. Chapter 7. The Final Move. Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears as the man advanced, the metallic glint of the weapon catching what little light there was in the alley. Reardon stood behind him, arms crossed, his expression one of cold indifference. It was clear they didn't expect Jacob to walk out of here. They thought this was the end. But Jacob hadn't come unprepared. With the hidden recorder still running in his pocket, he reached for his phone, which was already transmitting the audio of their conversation back to Claire in real time. As the man closed in, Jacob held his ground, knowing he only needed to buy a few more minutes. Claire would hear everything. If he could make Reardon confess, the whole case would fall apart. "Think about what you're doing, Reardon," Jacob said, keeping his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You think killing me will make this go away? It won't. People already know what you've done. I have evidence that ties you to Allison Harper, and it's more than enough to destroy you." Reardon's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. You have nothing." Jacob's heart raced, but he refused to show fear. "The money transfers, Reardon. Offshore accounts, all linked to you and your crew. Claire's already traced the payments you made to Allison. And now there's a photo of you paying off that thug last night. It's all there." The man with the weapon hesitated for a split second, glancing back at Reardon, as if seeking confirmation. That moment of doubt was all Jacob needed. "Don't listen to him," Reardon snapped, stepping forward. "He's lying." But Jacob pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "Am I? You think your guys will stay quiet once you go down? They'll turn on you the moment they're questioned. And that evidence is already out there. Even if you kill me, it won't disappear." Reardon's confidence wavered, his expression tightening with fear and rage. For a moment, it seemed as though he might try to walk away, to leave this mess behind and regroup. But then the man with the weapon lunged. Jacob ducked as the blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing him. In the chaos, he reached for a nearby trash can lid and swung it with all his strength, catching the man off guard and knocking him off balance. The weapon clattered to the ground. Jacob scrambled backward, his breath ragged, but he wasn't finished yet. Reardon's composure had shattered, his calm facade replaced with desperation. "You don't get it, do you, Wilder? You're out of your depth. No one's going to believe some lawyer over a cop." Jacob, still catching his breath, slowly rose to his feet. "Then why are you so scared? If I'm wrong, you'd have no reason to be here." The silence that followed was heavy, and in that moment, Jacob knew he had won. Reardon wasn't just scared, he was trapped. His options were closing in, and he realized it too late. The sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the tension. Jacob's backup plan had worked. Claire had sent the police, and they were closing in fast. Reardon's face twisted in fury as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "You think this is over?" Reardon spat, backing away toward the alley's exit. "It's never over." But it was. As the police cars screeched to a halt, officers swarmed the alley, weapons drawn. Reardon's man was quickly subdued, and Reardon himself was forced to the ground, handcuffed with the same cold steel he had used to imprison so many others. Jacob watched, his heart still racing, as Reardon was led away. The weight of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy fog. He had done it. Daniel Mercer would be cleared, and the corrupt network that had operated in the shadows for years was finally crumbling. An officer approached Jacob. "We've got them. You're safe now." Jacob nodded, though his thoughts were still scattered, his adrenaline slowly ebbing away. "I have recordings," he said, his voice steady now. "Everything you need to prove their involvement. Make sure it gets to the right people." As the police took over the scene, Jacob pulled out his phone and dialed Claire. She picked up after the first ring. "Jacob, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he replied, his voice tired but relieved. "It's over, Claire. Reardon's in custody. We got him." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a sigh of relief. "Thank God." I'll make sure the evidence goes straight to the district attorney. Jacob sat on the curb, the weight of the entire ordeal finally catching up to him. He had been inches from disaster, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Daniel Mercer would be freed, and Reardon would finally face the consequences of his actions. As dawn began to break over the city, Jacob allowed himself a small smile. The case had been brutal, the risks higher than he had ever anticipated, but he had seen it through to the end. And in the world of law, that was all that mattered. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.